Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports, and we have another 2023 NBA mock draft on the channel. There will be no trades in this one. We're just about a week away from my final 2023 NBA mock draft, so you're going to see quite a few adjustments in this one. And then for my final one, we're going to really settle and land on some of the things that I expect to fully happen. This one I want to discuss some potential happenings, things that are maybe a little bit different than some of my other mocks. You're going to see that in the top 3, you're going to see that in the top 4, you're going to see that in the top 10, which really excites me for this video. Again, if you do enjoy the content or you're new here to Utility Sports, I would really recommend hitting that like button. It lets me know I'm doing a good job. Subscribe for more future NBA draft content. I'm already in the process of prepping stuff for my 2024 way too early NBA mock draft as well. Of course, brand new setup. Hopefully you guys do enjoy that too. I've been working very hard on that, and without further ado, let's jump into it here with the first overall pick, and that's the San Antonio Spurs, who of course were blessed by the lottery gods with the #1 selection. And a lot of people like to glance over this pick and kind of quickly talk about it. For me, I think it's really important to, for the final week, 9 days or so left of the draft process, I want to sing the praises of Victor Wembanyama, who I do believe is the best prospect I've had the luxury to evaluate. I was super high on Luka Doncic in his draft class, but I think Victor Wembanyama is in a world of his own for the players I've evaluated. Now, I was born in 1999, so it's not like I was necessarily evaluating LeBron James as a 4-year-old myself, but I just want to point out that I've never seen a player like him, and people are going to point to guys who have been similar frames, similar sizes that have been injured. I do think there's some validity to that, but a lot of them haven't had the skill set even that Victor Wembanyama has had. He also has a very good training regimen. He hasn't missed a game, playing in a multitude of professional level basketball games in a league that I think promotes more physicality than the NBA, and he's been extremely productive in that league as well. I've seen some people with a little bit of pushback saying, well, what if he's actually going up against true 7-footers every single night? And I don't think people really grasp what 7'5" fully means. It means he's 5 inches taller than a 7-footer. It's like putting a 6'3" player on LeBron James and asking him to physically match up. That's the height difference we're looking at. It doesn't lend itself to successful team defense, and I think Victor Wembanyama is going to be such a transcendent player in the NBA. He's going to be the best player I ever evaluate, in my opinion. I just don't see it very likely we see another player similar to him or like him in any way, which is really why he's truly an alien and a player who I think is going to completely remake what San Antonio is. They have the pieces to fit around him, and I think the Spurs are going to be a really nice team when it's all said and done. Moving into pick number 2, we have the Charlotte Hornets, and with the second overall pick in the 2023 NBA draft, in this mock, the Charlotte Hornets select Brandon Miller out of Alabama, and that's a big shakeup if you've been watching on the channel. And the reason I'm mocking this here, this is not necessarily something I fully believe is going to happen, but I wanted to use this video as an opportunity to fully discuss what if Charlotte actually does take Brandon Miller, and then kind of what are the repercussions of that with the entire draft board. You guys know I firmly believe that Scoot Henderson not only should be the second overall pick, but I still believe that he will be, despite the agenda that ESPN is trying to push right now with Jonathan Givony, who by the way is very good friends with Mike Schmitz, likely trying to push Scoot Henderson down the board to number 3, something I tweeted a week ago or so. And I don't believe that. I do think Scoot Henderson likely will be the second overall pick, but in this mock, I wanted to discuss about the rumors we've been hearing, which is Brandon Miller going second overall to the Charlotte Hornets, and a lot of people seem to think it's a done deal. In fact, DraftKings and other betting marketplaces have that as the odds-on favorite to be the second overall selection. And for the Hornets, what does that really mean? First of all, I think they're screwing up. You look back at other years where a team drafts off of fit, quote-unquote fit, not even that I agree with that, but quote-unquote fit, it just typically doesn't pan out very well. And then you also consider the fact of, hey, let's actually evaluate what Brandon Miller does compared to LaMelo Ball, and those two guys don't really complement each other that well. Now, I do think LaMelo Ball's passing is going to be very good setting up Brandon Miller in this situation, but I do think that there are some serious flaws as well to kind of the roster construction of two perimeter-centric players who both don't really finish super well at the rim. Now, LaMelo Ball's got a lot of touch. I think Brandon Miller's going to grow as a touch shooter, touch scorer inside the lane as well. But currently, he struggles big time when someone's actually in front of him putting their chest in his way of the rim. He gets very skinny and lanky, and because of that, he struggles to finish through and around contact, which is something LaMelo Ball's also had issues with at times early in his career, and I think that's been kind of the separating factor between him and Anthony Edwards in the early returns of their young careers. And I think realistically, we're going to see a similar kind of diversion between Scoot Henderson and Brandon Miller, where I think Scoot Henderson does all of the things very well that LaMelo Ball doesn't do well, which is finishing at the rim. Defensively, I think he's more engaged. I think he's going to be more impactful than Brandon Miller. So I think even though both of them are guards, Scoot Henderson, of course, kind of contradicts LaMelo Ball in that regard a little bit. I do think ultimately their fit together would actually be pretty good, because Scoot Henderson more of a downhill player, someone who can get to the rim and finish out of that. Just completely different prospect than Brandon Miller, and I think it's a game-changing difference between those two types of prospects. With the third overall pick in the 2023 NBA Draft, the Portland Trailblazers select Scoot Henderson from G League Ignite, and I think this is a huge home run for them if it does actually pan out this way, which is part of the reason I wanted to talk about this as a potential option that we could see potentially play out on draft night, because we haven't really had the opportunity in any of my mock draft videos on the channel to discuss Scoot Henderson, third overall to the Portland Trailblazers, and what that could potentially look like. First of all, it could be the changing of the guard literally there in Portland, as maybe Damian Lillard would look to request a trade if this pick isn't dealt. Now, I think there's a lot of rumors circulating around that possibility, and part of the reason that I believe ESPN is pushing the narrative that Scoot Henderson could fall to 3 is to perhaps bump up the price of a trade package for Mike Schmitz and company there in Portland, which I think is a legitimate thing that we have to consider at this point. But ultimately for Portland, drafting Scoot Henderson with this selection, it does just make a lot of sense as well for the long-term outlook of this team. You drafted Shaedon Sharpe last year, come back and get a very athletic guard again this year, and one that I think has a completely different play style than Shaedon Sharpe. Shaedon Sharpe more of a finisher, downhill slasher who is going to score for himself, score a lot in transition. Scoot Henderson does some of those things, but Scoot Henderson, a much better facilitator, someone who I think has a better live handle currently. Now, Shaedon Sharpe has potential to grow in a lot of these areas, and I'm not going to short sell him on what he could potentially grow into, but I think Scoot Henderson right now is further developed in some of those areas. And remember, Shaedon Sharpe was supposed to be in this draft class as well had he not reclassified. So realistically, you're a really young team then if you're Portland. You're putting a lot of your eggs in the development basket of what does Scoot Henderson and Shaedon Sharpe look like together long term. But I think that the early results, even if they're a little up and down, the long-term results I think would be magnificent. And if it actually does play out this way, that Portland has an opportunity to draft Scoot Henderson, and if they trade out for another established player, whether that's a Karl Anthony Towns or a Pascal Siakam, even though those players are better right now than Scoot Henderson, I think that they would strongly regret it for a very long time, because I believe Scoot Henderson is going to be a fantastic player. I think he's a fantastic prospect in my eyes. He is clearly the second best prospect in this draft, and if he's available at 3 and you pass on him, it's a huge opportunity wasted to kind of find your new point guard long-term behind Damian Lillard, and they have an opportunity to get it here after moving up in the lottery, and if they trade out of it to try and win now, I don't think they're going to be good enough. I don't think they're going to be good enough to beat Denver with the Pascal Siakam or with the Karl Anthony Towns. And if you're trying to push for a championship, you better have a pretty good team, not a team that finished 13th in the Western Conference this past season. Moving on to pick number 4, we have the Houston Rockets here now at this spot. In the Rockets, another trade destination. Karl Anthony Towns, another name to potentially consider here. Now, I know people are going to say, whoa, Ime Udoka would probably be rolling in his grave already because of concerns about James Harden and Karl Anthony Towns both in Houston as a realistic possibility at this point. I think Udoka would find creative ways to build a defense around those two guys, but I definitely understand some of those concerns. So let's say hypothetically the Rockets do just end up sticking here at 4, which I think is probably best for them long term. Now, Rafael Stone does have a lot of pressure on him to make a good decision here and to ultimately find a way to win as soon as this season, because they do owe a draft pick out to Oklahoma City. Now, there is a top 4 protection on that for 2024, but that could come into play here, where if Rafael Stone loses that draft pick but still misses the playoffs, maybe his time in Houston's up, which puts pressure on him to try and win, which is why this pick possibly could be available on draft night, which shapes up for a crazy potential for 2, maybe 3 trades in the top 4, which is unprecedented. I think the Houston Rockets, though, here, if they were to draft, would select Amen Thompson from the Overtime Elite 4th overall. I think it would be a really good selection for them. I'm very high on Amen Thompson myself. I'm a big believer in his game. He at 6'7", he's got the athletic profile that will supersede a lot of other prospects, not only in this year's draft, but in multiple drafts to come. I think he's just a special athlete, and it's not just, oh, he tested well at the combine type of athleticism. It's real functional athleticism that shows up on his game tape, and I think that's really a big differentiating factor between him and some other prospects that you've seen come in the past who are good athletes, and you think, okay, well, in transition some of this stuff shows. Amen Thompson's athleticism shows in the half court offensively, shows in the half court defensively, it shows in the full court, of course, on both ends of the floor. And when he has played against good competition, whether that was NBL teams this past summer, or if you're looking at his tape against some Mega Basket teams, he went on and shined. And I think that is really something you have to cling on to if you're a believer in his game, that in big moments against better teams than what he was consistently playing against in Overtime Elite, he showed out big time. And I think the Rockets here, no matter what you feel like's coming in the door through free agency, there's nothing guaranteed by June 22nd. There just isn't. Now, maybe with some tampering there could be. Of course, they'll never admit to that, but I just think the safe option here is drafting. Don't screw up your young core. I think you do have good young pieces. I think Ime Udoka is going to let these guys shine a little bit more, and making the right selection at 4 is, in my opinion, the best move for them long term, instead of rushing something and making a trade for a Siakam or a Karl Anthony Towns. Now, Jalen Brown I could get a little bit more on board with, but at the same time, I kind of like the youth that this team has. So if they're patient, it's not the end of the world, in my opinion. We'll see what they end up doing on draft night, though. I think it's a fascinating discussion to watch for. Moving on to pick number 5. Now we have the Detroit Pistons here. And at this spot, Detroit's been really a tough case for me to solve. And I think, you know, the top 4 is pretty clear. I know some people are kind of wavering off of Amen Thompson as a top 4 pick in this year's draft. I believe still that he will be, clearly. But now 5 is really where it opens up to me, because there's guys you could consider like a Cam Whitmore, a Taylor Hendricks, a Jarace Walker. Could Ausar Thompson go 5th overall, 1 spot behind his twin brother? Does Anthony Black find himself in play? Probably not to Detroit, just given the fact that they have Caden, Jade, and Ivy. What does this really look like now for Detroit, and how do they go about building this team from a fit perspective? And I think that's been a really important note that their front office is looking into. They want to find guys that fit, and they want to kind of accelerate this thing, and they want Monty Williams to be the one who overlooks that and oversees that development. And I think a player who, in the right situation, can really outshine what his collegiate production was is Cam Whitmore, who is the 5th overall pick in this mock draft to Detroit out of Villanova. I think Cam Whitmore, a player who significantly underachieved, especially when it comes to transition scoring. I just don't think his transition points per game really matched what his history shows, especially when you look at his Team USA film and some of the things that he had done prior to going to Villanova. And a big part of that is Villanova likes to play a slowed down style of play, especially post coaching change. They actually ranked only in the 6th percentile for pace of play. So they're a really slow team, and Cam Whitmore is a guy who likes to get out and run. And if you think about what Detroit has, it really gives them a combination of both facets that they could play with. Jaden Ivey, Cam Whitmore, 2 guys who I think are going to be beneficial to pushing the pace and running in transition, which I think would be really good for the Pistons. But I also think that with Cade Cunningham, they have the ability to slow it down, hunt half-court offense, and generate good shots consistently, which is something we know Monty Williams is going to want to look for as well. As his tenure with Phoenix, with Chris Paul there, they did play a slow-down style of play. So I think Detroit, you can have kind of the best of both worlds here. You have that athletic combination between Ivy, Whitmore, and then you could maybe include Jalen Duren into that. But then you also have that kind of slowed down point forward type body with Cade Cunningham, who probably does run point guard for this team. But Ivy can run that as well. And you've got a really nice duo that I'm a big believer in. And now you're adding a really good physical wing to that team, and a guy who I think can really help advance where that team's going to be going as soon as next year. Moving into pick 6, now we have the Orlando Magic, who have 2 picks in the lottery this year, pick 6 and pick 11. They're one of the more fascinating teams to talk about because they have a really great opportunity to implement more young talent into the already existing great young core that they have, that I think was really impressive this past year. And I think a lot of people are buying the stock on Orlando, as they should be. And at 6, there's a lot of good options out here. I'm ending up opting for Taylor Hendricks out of UCF. The Central Florida guy stays very close to home with the Orlando Magic, and I think it's a really good selection for them for a few different reasons. First of all, Taylor Hendricks, to me, very versatile player defensively. Can guard out in the perimeter, plays with pretty good balance, moves his feet decently well for his size. But then specifically what I love about him is his ability to stick around the rim, block shots, and really contest shots around the rim in a way that even Wendell Carter doesn't. I think Wendell Carter, you kind of assume shot blocker, but if you actually look at his per game statistics, he doesn't block that many shots. He doesn't block that many shots per 36 minutes either. And I think, there's some pros to that. He does a good job challenging around the rim. He plays vertically, and that's not a bad thing. But I think someone who's a little bit more intimidating, which is what I think Taylor Hendricks is going to grow into, gives you kind of an interesting quote-unquote small ball 5. Now, Taylor Hendricks measured bigger than some other centers in this draft, so it's not like Taylor Hendricks is this tiny player who you're asking to go out and play way overmatched at the center spot. It's just not that way. I think Taylor Hendricks has the frame, the strength, the size to realistically give you good quality 5 minutes. But he also is just like naturally a 4 with his frame and his shooting ability. He's got the touch to spread you out. And I think more shooting the better in Orlando, which is ultimately why I opted for Taylor Hendricks here, because he has a very good refined 3-point shot over 39% from 3 this past year for UCF. A lot of those came off of catch and shoot, which is exactly the type of shots he's going to be shooting. Playing off of Franz Wagner and Cole Anthony and Paolo Banchero, of course. I think Orlando's a really good landing spot for Taylor Hendricks. I think his defensive capabilities is really going to take Orlando to the next step on that end of the floor. They already have a lot of strength, physically gifted wings. You're adding a really good one here as well, who I think is going to be a prototypical fit into the NBA as kind of this hybrid 3-and-D forward, and a player who's going to bring a lot of versatility to the game. Moving on to pick 7, now we have the Indiana Pacers here. And for me, the Pacers, a team that I think is laser focused on the trio of Cam Whitmore, Taylor Hendricks, and Jarace Walker. And like my last mock draft up on the channel, 2 of those 3 guys are off the board at this point, leaving the obvious selection for them to be Jarace Walker out of Houston. And I don't think that they're upset about this at all. Jarace Walker has tremendous ball skills. I think he's a growing facilitator. Now, it's not like he's going to be a guy who's averaging 5-6 assists a game, but for his position, I think it's a positional strength, and something that, with his ability to put the ball on the deck and create for himself specifically off the move, something that a lot of other 4s typically don't show. Now, I think he's a little bit smaller than other people were expecting. Not from a physical frame perspective, did measure in at 248 pounds at the combine, but he only measured in at about 6'6" without shoes. Now, it's not like that's tiny. In fact, it's a decent size. He's going to be about 6'7.5" with shoes on. But I do think that there is some questions about, okay, what's the upward versatility for him? Is he going to be able to bang with 5s every once in a while? And with the strength and frame, you would think so. But the hope is that he can kind of grow into this ultimate player who is a two-way star. And I think that's really the ceiling for him, is he has the offensive skill set, the shot making capability, the ability to put the ball on the deck and score. Those are the things you're looking for and checking off a list of, can this guy become an offensive star? The question is he good enough to do all of those things? And is an NBA offense going to trust him? Because with how the NBA is now, points per possession is king. Teams look at that closer than anything else, and they really do put a lot of weight into it, and it dictates the way that they play. So if you're not going to be great in isolation, if you're not going to be great enough as a creator, are you going to be relegated to a role of catching and shooting or attacking closeouts? And if so, then why would you not prefer Taylor Hendricks, which is exactly why I've kind of landed on this order in my mock, where Taylor Hendricks goes 6th, Jarace Walker goes 7th, but I do think Walker's upside is a little bit higher than Jarace Walker. So I think than Taylor Hendricks, excuse me. So I think it's going to be interesting to see who goes where on draft night, but I think those two players are very closely tied, and I think there's going to be a lot of tough decisions that have to be made between picks 5 and 7 regarding those two guys. Moving on to pick number 8, now we have the Washington Wizards here at this spot. And for Washington, I think Michael Winger's in a spot, their new president of basketball operations, to draft based off of fit, or draft based off of upside, or draft based off of, hey, who's the player that I trust the most to be an impact guy for the next 10 years in the NBA? And that's exactly what I'm mocking here for them. We're going with Anthony Black out of Arkansas, 8th overall here to the Washington Wizards. And in some of my previous mocks, I've talked about how this could theoretically be a really good fit for Washington, assuming they potentially keep Porzingis and Kuzma. Based on the recent words from Michael Winger, it sounds less likely that that's going to be a reality. But I still think that there is an argument to be had that Anthony Black is still worth the 8th overall selection here for Washington. Perhaps he's worth an even higher selection to another team. But Washington specifically makes sense because I think the one thing that Washington currently lacks is players that I feel really good about for the next 8 to 10 years. And there's a couple on the team. I think Daniel Gafford's going to have a decently long career. I think Corey Kispert, Denny Avdia will as well. But I think adding one more guy in there that, hey, maybe it doesn't move the needle a ton for you right away, but if you give Anthony Black a couple of years to develop, you put the ball in his hands, he can play off of Beal if you decide to keep Beal. If you keep Kuzma and Porzingis, he's an instant fit. But if you do pivot off of those guys, which I think is in the best interest of Washington, as I expect them to enter a full rebuild and kind of retooling here, I still think Anthony Black is a good selection for them, even though I think people assume, oh, well, you should go with the high upside, high ceiling guy if you're going rebuild. For Washington, it's about thinking, okay, Anthony Black's not going to make us win 25 extra games our first year with him, right? It's about how is he going to complement other players in the future? And that's kind of what San Antonio did, drafting Jeremy Sohan, Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell, a lot of players who have really good talents. They're going to be very good in complementary roles. And I think Anthony Black will be as well. I think, in fact, you could argue he's the best connector in this year's draft. And ultimately, Washington would have their eyes on future drafts and picking for potential in the top 3 or 4, assuming that at some point they'll bottom out and kind of be one of the worst teams in the league, which is what I'm expecting. Anthony Black could be a nice contributing player down the road next to that other great talent that you're able to draft at a later date. Now at pick 9, we have the Utah Jazz, and I think the Jazz are a very interesting team as well, just given the fact that, they kind of overachieved. Not that they were a bad team, but based on what the expectations were. Walker Kessler had a fantastic rookie season. I'm a big believer in Walker Kessler. I think he's a really good young player, of course. Was all rookie first team, very deservedly. And I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of what happens with his progression, his production going forward. And I also want to see what Lauri Markkanen looks like after coming back from the Finnish Army this offseason, and kind of, does he continue the tear he was on, or does NBA defense and kind of the adjustments that other teams make to guarding him slow him down a little bit? I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch for. But ultimately, 9th overall, I landed on Ausar Thompson for this team because I think Utah, I just talked about Washington where, hey, look, they're not going to be a team that needs to take some of those big swings yet. In fact, I think for them it's about, can we get more good talent in the door? Utah, I think, is kind of the flip side here, especially this early on in their rebuild, because at this point they might be too good to ever get that top 3 or 4 pick like what I just talked about with Washington. Unless they trade Lauri Markkanen or just, kind of blatantly tank next season, I don't see them really getting a top 3 or 4 pick unless they get really, really lucky in the draft lottery in the future. So because of that, an upside swing on a guy like Ausar Thompson, who has some of those physicals that you're looking for in what could be a star level player at some point down the road. He handles the ball a little bit. He's shown flashes. Now, he doesn't handle it as much as Amen. He's not as good of a passer as Amen, but I do think he's the best breakout passer in the draft, which I think is intriguing for Utah. I think Ausar Thompson, in the right role, playing for Will Hardy, can contribute to winning decently quickly because he's used to playing off the basketball and he's athletic. And he gives something to Utah that they don't have right now on the wing, which is just elite athleticism. And I'm not talking like really great college athleticism. I'm talking really great NBA athleticism. And that's what Ausar Thompson has. I think people are going to be impressed significantly watching Amen and Ausar Thompson in the NBA. Their physicals, I still think, are going to pop off the screen, even next to other NBA talent. And Utah, I think, is one of those teams that should take a swing here, because if they miss, well, they have all the future assets as well. They've got 2 other picks in this first round here. They've got multiple picks coming in the future from Cleveland and Minnesota. They're in a spot where they're going to be able to continue adding talent. A swing here makes a lot of sense actually for them. Moving on to pick number 10, we have the Dallas Mavericks here. And for Dallas, it's been a kind of tough road since trading for Kyrie Irving. I don't think that's all Kyrie Irving's fault, but I think it's kind of the byproduct of running a team like it's NBA 2K, where you're trading for stars instead of looking at actual team construction and team building. The Mavericks do have a lot of flaws on their roster, and I would know because I'm a Mavericks fan. And it's been really tough to watch and really tough to see how this team's going to perform and play, just because there are some significant issues with this roster, and one of them is shooting. You could also look at the defense, rebounding, and rim protection as another massive flaw in the team. And there's a few options out there to address that. But I ultimately landed on Gradey Dick from Kansas as the option here for the Dallas Mavericks, because I think off of Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic, what you really want to promote is a lot of driving lane openings and ability for Luka Doncic to play in isolation a little bit more frequently, get to spots and score. And I think having a really good catch and shoot shooter would go a long way in opening that up. Gradey Dick is a fantastic one, and in fact, he would be arguably the best catch and shoot guy on the Mavericks day one of his career. Now, Kyrie Irving definitely has an argument to that as well. He's been a fantastic spot up shooter in his career, although that's not typically the play style you think of when you hear Kyrie Irving. He has been very good in that role as well when he's been asked to do that. So Kyrie Irving, Gradey Dick spacing off of Luka Doncic works very well. I think Gradey Dick spacing off of Kyrie Irving works very, very well. And I think his kind of winning mentality, the plays that he makes on the floor, whether that's crashing the offensive glass, being committed to being a solid team defender despite some point of attack concerns. I think ultimately Dallas is getting a good player here with Gradey Dick, a guy who I think is going to impact winning. And I think honestly has a higher ceiling than a lot of other people acknowledge. Dallas here, I think, getting a really good selection, 10th overall. Moving on to pick 11, we're back to the Orlando Magic, who, remember, at 6 went with Taylor Hendricks. And now at pick 11, they're in an opportunistic spot here to either take a swing on upside or address that shooting need that we did discuss earlier as a realistic concern. Now, there is some shooting on the board with Gradey Dick off of it, though. There's not a guy that I'm in love with at pick 11. I think some people would consider Jordan Hawkins here, and I think that there is some validity to that as an option, because he is one of the better movement shooters in this year's draft, arguably the best. But Orlando at 11, to me, like an upside swing just does make some sense too. Otherwise, trading this pick out, if you could get future assets for it, extra assets, I wouldn't even be mad at that result. But for them here, I landed with Bilal Coulibaly, teammate with Victor Wembanyama for Metropolitans 92 this past year. He shot 45% from 3 during the regular season. Now, is very low volume, just over 1 3-point attempt per game. So you can't really count on that as gospel. but you can look at it and say, look, he's flashed good shooting. Now the free throw percentage goes up and down a little bit, but also just during the playoffs in the LNB Pro A League, for Mets 92, I think Bilal Coulibaly's been taking a bigger role. He's been playing with the ball in his hands significantly more, and I think he's a player who has really grown on a lot of people. He's ascending upwards currently, and I think, you know, realistically, a lot of people were looking at him as kind of a fringe top 20 pick. I think he's strongly cemented himself in the lottery at this point, and a player that there's going to be a lot of consideration around pick 10 and later for him, in my opinion. We'll see ultimately where Orlando goes on draft night, but walking away with Taylor Hendricks and Bilal Coulibaly feels like really good upside to me, and a pretty strong floor as well, as players who I think do different things, operate differently than some of the other pieces that they already have on their current roster. Moving on now to pick number 12, we do have the Oklahoma City Thunder here, and for OKC, I keep landing on a player that I really like for them because I think he addresses some of the concerns I would have for this roster in general, and that's Leonard Miller from G League Ignite. I think Leonard Miller, physically, his frame is so much improved from where it was a year ago. He's put on pretty good muscle, and I think he has taken full advantage of the G League Ignite program in a way that we've really never seen before. He was extremely productive, 18 points a game, 11 rebounds a game, over 3 offensive rebounds a game, and I think you're starting to get the message here for what Oklahoma City's missing, which is strong, rebounding, physical presence, and a guy who can just go and hunt the basketball. Now, they've got a ton of skill. You think about the pieces that they have on this team. They have guys who can knock down shots. They have guys who can take people off the dribble. They can make the right read, kick out back to the perimeter. They have a very good drive and kick game, and I think Leonard Miller's upside plays into that as well, as he was a point forward type during his prep school days, and I think because of that history, Sam Presti, first of all, will be intrigued, and then secondly, he can fit into that drive and kick offense that they like to operate with, while still giving them something they don't have right now, which is strong physical rebounding capability to kind of complement Chet Holmgren going into next season. Moving into pick number 13 now, we have the Toronto Raptors here. With this pick, Toronto, I think there's a few things that they can consider, but one thing, after hiring Darko to be their head coach, I think that there's going to be questions about Fred VanVleet, and is he going to really return to the Toronto Raptors? My indications early on here are that Fred VanVleet will likely be playing in a different NBA city as early as next season. So with that, Toronto, I think, will be strongly considering a guard, and just knowing Masai Ujiri, I think he's going to be looking for prototypical size. I think he's going to be looking for a little bit of shot making, the ability to handle in the pick and roll, and just overall peripheral vision as a playmaker. And the player that really sticks out to me in that situation, 13th overall, is Jalen Hood-Schifino from Indiana. He is a very good balanced jump shooter, specifically off the pick and roll. I think he's really adept using the screen game to get to spots. He can screen, rescreen, and work off of that. I think he's a talented player holistically, and a guy who I think is going to make a high impact in the NBA at some point. Now, year one, are they going to be asking him to start? They might throw him into the fire like that, and I don't think that's a bad thing for him. In fact, I think he's one of the few guards that I would say, yeah, go out there, let him fly, let him work, and see kind of how it plays out. Toronto, if you're in this spot, you don't really have anything to lose. I know people look at Scotty Barnes kind of as a point guard. I think Scotty Barnes is more of a point forward, which is good. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not a slight at Scotty Barnes at all. I just think having some shot making from the guard spot does make some sense. A guy who still can pass, make decisions, handle the pick and roll. It's going to amplify Jakob Poeltl, which is important. And I think ultimately the Raptors here make a really strong selection with Jalen Hood-Schifino, 13th overall. Pick 14 now, we have the New Orleans Pelicans. And for New Orleans, there's been some speculation that maybe they want to move up in the draft. Are they looking at Scoot Henderson moving up to pick number 3? What would that entail? I'm hoping to record a video on that at some point this week to kind of break down all the potential options we could see New Orleans look to execute. I'm really excited for that one when we get to it, but let's assume they stay at 14. What could they look to draft? And I think with some of those rumors around Scoot Henderson, it closely matches what my identity of the team is, which is kind of lacking that point guard, the guy who's going to be a decision maker for them. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a true full-time point guard. It can be kind of a combo guard who plays off of CJ at times, but can have the ball in his hands and make decisions as well. And I think a player in this draft that fits that description pretty well is Kobe Bufkin from Michigan. I think off the ball, he does a very good job as a connector. He makes the extra pass. He's probably one of the better touch passers in this draft when it comes to getting the ball back out quickly. It's an important thing for the way that the Michigan Wolverines play, and I think it's going to be an important element for New Orleans as well, with how drive and kick happy they can be, especially when Zion is on the floor and how dominant he is getting downhill. I think having smart players around that does go a long way. Kobe Bufkin actually compares pretty similarly to Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who, now that's a little bit hopeful. I'm not saying he's going to be the next SGA, but I think that's kind of what you're hoping he becomes. 14th overall probably won't be that. I'm not suggesting he will be, but if you look at kind of the physical profile, some of the college film, I think that the two mirror each other decently well. Now the question is, does he have the work ethic and the ability to kind of hone in his game the way that SGA did? And that's really the tough part. That's the part where I can't realistically bet on that. But New Orleans, I think, is getting a fantastic player, and a player who's going to help them make the playoffs as early as next season if they draft him 14th overall. Pick 15, now we have the Atlanta Hawks. In a lot of my mocks, I've really liked to select Jordan Hawkins, but in this one, I'm switching it up a little bit, and I'm actually going in a completely different way than we've really looked at most oftentimes for the Atlanta Hawks, and we're going with Dereck Lively, the second center out of Duke. And for me, I think when you're drafting either a point guard or a center, you have to do it about 1 or 2 years in advance at least to get the best results. Because if you're going to throw a center or a point guard into the fire, you're typically going to walk out with some burns. And the reason for that is because point guards have so much responsibility offensively, and centers have so much responsibility defensively, and the scheme, the actual learning curve of adjusting to the NBA typically is one that causes a lot of young guys to struggle. Dereck Lively, you draft him now, give him time to sit behind Capella and Okongwu. There's no rush. He can learn. He's going to adjust to Quinn Snyder's system and scheme, which I think would be a really great place for him to land. He's got very similar measurables to Rudy Gobert. Not suggesting that he will be the next Rudy Gobert. Gobert has insane timing, Hall of Fame defensive acumen. Dereck Lively's hoping to be that, right? And if you think about what coach would you want a 7'1" player with an incredible standing reach and wingspan to go to, Quinn Snyder would be my argument to be one of those guys. Especially if you're giving him time to adjust and learn the NBA without having to play him 30 minutes a night year one. I think that's the best case scenario for Dereck Lively individually. Now you could argue maybe Atlanta has other needs, other things that they need to consider here. And I think that's a fair argument. Like I've said, Jordan Hawkins has been a player I've mocked a significant amount of times, 15th overall to Atlanta, because I think they do need more player movement. But I think realistically, if there's going to be a player that can elevate what Dereck Lively is offensively, that would be Trae Young, who's one of the best pick and roll passers in the league. And then outside of that, I think if there's going to be a player in this class outside of Victor Wembanyama who can help alleviate some of the difficulties of playing Trae Young defensively, it'd probably be Dereck Lively. So kind of a unique pairing, pretty solid get for Atlanta, and they're getting some more size. Although it might take a year to see this guy consistently on the floor, I still think it's a really nice addition for them, 15th overall. Moving on to pick 16, we have the Utah Jazz here now at this spot. Remember, they went with Ausar Thompson, 9th overall with their previous selection. Now at 16, they're in a spot here where they could go with more upside, or they could take a player that Danny Ainge is drooling over, and that's exactly who we're going to mock here. Cason Wallace goes 16th overall to the Utah Jazz, and I think Danny Ainge feels like the winner of the draft at this point, not only getting Ausar Thompson at 9, kind of that big swing, the high upside guy, but he gets a player now at 16 that he just really likes in Cason Wallace. Now he measured a little bit small, 6'2" at his pro day, or at the NBA Combine, excuse me, but he is in a spot where he's going to a team that is competitive, which I think is probably one of the better words to sum up Cason Wallace. Now, I know that Kentucky didn't do a ton of winning this past year for kind of that program standard, but I think Cason Wallace is a winning player. I think he makes winning plays. I think he makes high impact plays. And I think for Utah, the fact that they owe a pick themselves, they're not super concerned about their draft status for next year. I think that's part of the reason why they would like to go with Ausar Thompson, is to take that upside, given the fact that they probably don't have that pick next year. But then you come back with Cason Wallace as kind of that, like, hey, here's our glue guy, a guy that can help us on both ends of the floor. He's got really active hands, and he's a smart, intuitive defender. And I think for Utah, you can really talk yourself into that outside of the lottery. He goes outside of the lottery because of some of those frame and size concerns. He's been a very typical lottery selection in most of my mock drafts. Slides just a little bit in this one, but still feels like a really good pick for Utah at 16. Moving on to pick 17, we have the Los Angeles Lakers here now at this spot. And the Lakers are extremely happy because one thing that this team needs is significantly more shooting. I think that's really the one thing that you can constantly point to as a need. And I think there's going to be some movement when it comes to who's being traded out the door. I think one of those guys will be Malik Beasley. And interestingly enough, they're going to use this selection to replace Malik Beasley with a younger, cheaper version in Jordan Hawkins, a guy who I think actually compares very similarly to Malik Beasley in terms of the physicals and kind of the overall skill set as a movement shooter, and a guy who's not afraid to pull literally any single shot on the floor from behind the three-point line. I think Jordan Hawkins would be an intriguing fit here with the Lakers because he gives Darvin Ham, a guy who, well, one, you can run hammer action with, which is pretty important for Darvin Ham. Obviously a set he likes to go to, given the fact that it was named after him. But also outside of that, you know, he's just very adept and experienced running off of staggers and flares and pin downs. I'm sure he'd become a great Spain screener and shooter out of that too, just given the fact that he's literally elite at nearly every single type of movement three-point shooting. I think the Lakers here just get a really nice player who complements their play style, complements kind of what they need on the roster a little bit more of. And I think all in all, it's a really strong selection for them at pick 17. Moving on to pick 18, we have the Miami Heat here now at this selection. I think the Heat are probably a little disappointed coming off that finals loss in 5 games, but I think they had a heck of a run. So first of all, congratulations to the Miami Heat. If you're a Heat fan tuning in just now, just know I'm very impressed with the way that your team played in the postseason. I think Duncan Robinson showed out big time, again, which I'm very happy about. I think Jimmy Butler had a great postseason series, or postseason just in general. I think after his ankle turn, just wasn't quite the same player, which is understandable. Bam Adebayo proved once again why he's such a good player, especially defensively and with his dribble handoff capability. But 18th overall here for Miami. I'm looking at kind of a big swing on potential and a player here who maybe we would see the draft rights get traded, say, to Portland in pursuit of Damian Lillard. Not saying that's a done deal or anything, but I do think that would be something that at least gets discussed and talked about, is can Miami make a move for Damian Lillard or another star level player to go around Jimmy Butler and the remaining pieces on the team that just made the championship series, didn't win it in the finals, but can they improve their roster via trade? I think that's going to be a big question, but let's assume they keep pick 18. They're going with Keyonte George here from Baylor, a guy who earlier in the year a lot of people assumed would be a top 10 pick. For me, I was kind of a little bit lower on him the entire time, kind of seeing him as a hot shot maker. When he's on, he's on. When he's not, he's not. Now, from a talent perspective, though, he does have the talent to take and make tough shots. He can generate looks for himself. I think the next area of growth for him is generating shots for others, which that's always a tough thing to do, especially for young guards, is kind of growing into that area and learning how to do that consistently. But for Miami, you kind of don't need him to do that. I think he can be a nice bench spark plug for you if you're still picking here, assuming Gabe Vincent is, back in the fold next year. Max Strus as well. You have Duncan Robinson. Kyle Lowry's kind of aging out, but I think he had a pretty productive postseason for himself. So I think Miami's going to be an interesting team to watch, but I think guard is really probably one of the points they're going to look at. I think, with the way Caleb Martin played this postseason, maybe they feel a little bit more comfortable with their forward room just in general. They do have Haywood Highsmith, who has pretty active and in good hands defensively. So I think Miami, you could sell yourself on what you currently have. Maybe take an upside swing on a guy like Keyonte George at this spot. Moving on to pick number 19 now, we see the Golden State Warriors here. And for Golden State, I think this is a really tough team to mock currently because Bob Myers is out. As president, of course, did not renew his contract with the team. So we don't have a lot of history and insight to what this team could potentially look to do. And because of that, it's going to be kind of tough. Now, what they have historically done with Bob Myers running their drafts recently is draft off of upside and potential. You saw that with kind of Wiseman, Kuminga, I think are two prime examples. Even Moses Moody to a certain extent as a shot maker, shot creator type. So Golden State at 19, I think we're going to continue that trend as a potential thing that they could look to do. And the player that I'm specifically landing on here is Nick Smith Jr. out of Arkansas, a guy who before the year started was a projected top 5 pick, a player who I thought with his touch and shot making capability from both the mid-range and the three-point line would be a very highly intriguing prospect for a lot of teams, but he just did not have a very good freshman season at all. Shot 37% from the field. The touch just kind of came and went. He struggled to get by his guy consistently, kind of resulting in a lot of tough looks, and obviously that played into his efficiency a fair deal. And I think ultimately for Nick Smith Jr., if there's one thing that you're kind of banking on, it's the fact that, hey, he was playing kind of injured and kind of in and out of the lineup because of a knee injury. What does he look like if he's fully healthy and kind of able to be a part of a full season? And maybe you look at that as a concern because, hey, he missed time already for a knee injury as a guard, a very slim guard, by the way. Or you could look at that as a positive and say, look, maybe his production, you can't really use that as a fair scale to judge him. And I think both sides could have real legitimacy to that. But 19th here, I see Golden State taking a swing on a guy who probably doesn't fit their team. But that's okay because that's what they've historically done. Pick 20, we have the Houston Rockets now at this spot. And I think for Houston, it's an interesting spot to be drafting here now. After going with Amen Thompson, 4th overall, I think going at number 20, it'd be very smart to take a guy that they've had in the building, a guy that I know that they do like internally, and that's Jett Howard from Michigan. And I think for Houston, there's a few areas to really upgrade on this roster. Point guard, small forward, and kind of more center versatility, especially defensively. And with the centers available, I did consider a couple of them here, but I felt like Jett Howard was a guy that made a ton of sense. I know he really loves the Houston area. He would love to play for the Houston Rockets. In fact, on his own Instagram, he has a picture of him in Houston Rockets gear. So I think that it's something that does make some sense. If Jett Howard were to have a promise in the first round, my assumption would be that it's the Houston Rockets at pick 20. And I think realistically, grabbing him here does make some sense because of his connectivity. I mentioned this earlier for Kobe Bufkin as a guy who, pretty good connector, just with the way that Michigan plays, you have to be. Jett Howard, of course, does that as well. And I think with his size and his frame, first of all, I think he's slimmed down a little bit since where he was during his freshman season, which is good. Kind of lost some of that baby fat, which you typically see on young college players. And I think for the Rockets here, it's a definite upgrade over Jae'Sean Tate long term. I think he would really go a long way in kind of helping Ime Udoka kind of generate the ball movement that he's looking for. He can attack off the dribble, and I think he's just overall a very talented player, and Houston gets a good one here at number 20. Moving on to 21, we have the Brooklyn Nets with 2 selections in a row, picks 21 and number 22 in this draft. At 21 here, I have them going with James Nnaji out of Barcelona, a player who just recently was working out with Serge Ibaka. Ended up having a pretty impressive workout from what I've seen from that. And a guy who I think is going to be climbing up some boards as a potential first-round pick, just given the fact that he has a lot of the physical tools that typically draw bigs, some top 10, top 15 type interest. Now in this draft, it's very hard to just use those physical tools and be a top 5 or 10 pick, just given the fact that there's a ton of talent. I think this is one of the deepest drafts we've seen in recent years. I think it's one of the best drafts at the top as well in recent years. So because of that, there's a lot of competition for who those top 10, top 15 type of picks are. So James Nnaji maybe doesn't move up the board significantly, but we do see him now finally at 21 as a player who can really help Brooklyn with those athletic traits, getting rebounds specifically. I feel like I mentioned this in every mock draft, but I think it's very important when you're considering what a team could look to draft. You have to think about the head coach and what he wants, what he thinks is missing from the team. And Jacques Vaughn seemingly always mentioned rebounding. And, with Ben Simmons kind of not being able to go out there consistently and being a significantly less impactful version of himself, I do think the Nets need more rebounding. And I think James Nnaji is a guy that can definitely give it to them on a nightly basis. Pick 22, here's the Brooklyn Nets again, and at this spot, after going with James Nnaji 21st overall, I have them going with Brice Sensabaugh out of Ohio State at number 22. The reason why we have Ohio State's Brice Sensabaugh going here is I think Brooklyn kind of taking a swing on upside. I've seen people say that Brice Sensabaugh is maybe a top 5 player in the draft on their big board. I myself don't see that. I don't agree with that assessment, but he does have the 3-level shot making to at least open your eyes up to that possible outcome at some point. Now, I think that's a big bet, something I myself can't really believe in or kind of take the gamble on as a top 20 pick, but at 22, maybe that's something you can sell yourself on and say, look, if you think his triple threat game is something you want to rely on and play through a little bit more, I think that could make some sense, especially for Brooklyn, given the fact that after their Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving trades, they were kind of like a weird collection of talent, but not talent that necessarily fits together. So it's more about finding the pieces that you think could work, finding more shot making, shot creation, which could go a long way for this team, because outside of Mikal Bridges and Spencer Dinwiddie, I think this team is lacking just a little bit of that half-court creation. Cam Johnson did take a small step forward after the trade. Of course, Mikal Bridges took a massive step forward, which really did help out how the Nets offense was looking, but I still think that they're maybe a day late and a dollar short in that regard. So Brice Sensabaugh is someone who plays through contact well, gets to spots on the floor, and can score. I think that definitely does help Brooklyn, but he's also a skilled enough shot maker to play off the basketball as well. Moving on to number 23, we have the Portland Trailblazers now. With this selection, remember, we had them go with Scoot Henderson at number 3 in this mock, and at 23 they find themselves in a spot where they can add a really good player in Kris Murray out of Iowa, and a player that I know Mike Schmitz himself likes a lot too. Mike Schmitz was very, very high on Keegan Murray as a prospect, and it wouldn't surprise me to see him very high on Kris Murray, his twin brother. Although they're not the same player, I think Kris Murray is significantly worse than Keegan, as indicated by going 23rd in this mock instead of 4th, where Keegan Murray went last year. I think still a player who is talented. Now, his shot making fluctuates a little bit more than Keegan's. I think his decision making is a little bit behind where Keegan's is. I think he's just a little bit less athletic as well. So you're looking at kind of diminished traits from a really good player in the NBA, but still a guy who I think can be impactful. He has size. He, at his best, can knock down the 3-ball rather consistently. Now, that does come and go a little bit. Now, when he's not at his best, it's very inconsistent. We've kind of had a couple of seasons like that. We've had a season where he was dominant as a 3-point shooter. And if you're Portland, you're trying to find more size perimeter shooting around, whether that's Dame or Scoot or Shaedon Sharpe or Simons, whatever that looks like to you. You're trying to find skilled size, and I think Kris Murray's a good example of it here, 23rd overall. Pick 24, we have the Sacramento Kings, and with this selection, the Sacramento Kings select Dariq Whitehead, forward out of Duke, and a player who should be considered one of the steals of the draft at this spot, because he was the National High School Player of the Year just a year ago, and honestly a guy that I had thought was going to be a lock to be a top 5 pick. Now, he did deal with a foot injury, kind of shook up his production his freshman season. Now, he was still very efficient, shot over 42% from 3 while injured, which is exactly my point on why this is potentially a huge steal for Sacramento. The most potent offense in the NBA in 2022-2023 adds even more good offense in Dariq Whitehead, but I also think he's a guy who can help them defensively long-term, because he has a lot of the traits that you're looking for from a solid wing defender. He's got the length, he's got decent size to him, he's, I think, relatively strong, plays balanced on both ends of the floor, and I think because of that, he can fit really smoothly off of Sabonis and Fox, which is really the most important thing when you're looking about this team trying to build and go forward. I think Dariq Whitehead fits a lot of those offensive needs that this team still has in terms of shot making and perimeter scoring. But outside of that, defensively, I don't think he's going to be an eyesore for them. And I think that's really important. Now, I think he's got ways to grow. Most rookies do. But we'll see if Sacramento's the place that can really help garner and grow him. And with how Mike Brown did his first year coaching the Kings, it wouldn't surprise me to see Dariq Whitehead take massive steps forward, going forward with Mike Brown in Sacramento. Pick 26, we have the Memphis Grizzlies here. And with this selection, I have the Memphis Grizzlies targeting Amari Bailey out of UCLA, a player who a lot of people have kind of as a fringe first-round pick. In some of my mocks, he's appeared toward the back end, and in some mocks, he hasn't, simply because, like a lot of others, I do look at Amari Bailey kind of as this fringe first-round guy, and it's more so because of the position he plays, because of point guard, it's not really a needed position around the league. A lot of teams have talented, skilled guards, and the demand doesn't outweigh the supply, which you look at how many guards have already gone in this draft. For me, it's difficult to see really good landing spots for guards because of some of the issues of actually like seeing, oh, is this guy better than whoever they could add in free agency, or is this guy better than what they have existing on their current roster right now? And a lot of times the answer to that is no for me, and I think that's true here too. Amari Bailey is not better than John Morant, and he's not better than Tyus Jones, but I do think with Morant missing some time with his suspension, the fact that they cut Kennedy Chandler, who they drafted in the second round last year, there is a need for another guard in the room. Amari Bailey can do that. He's a strong, physical, defensive-minded guard who can also make some plays offensively. But I also think that there is a possibility we see Tyus Jones get traded on draft night in a deal maybe for Nnaji Anunoby or another higher-level wing like that maybe Memphis views as a long-term upgrade to their core five, the five guys that they see closing games for them in the postseason, which is the reason you do that. So now you draft Amari Bailey here to be the long-term eventual replacement to Tyus Jones and open up the pathway for John Morant to be your point guard. Amari Bailey fills in the minutes when he's out of the game, and you go from there and try and really build out a really strong starting 5 unit and a closing 5 unit, which I think is really the most important part of winning basketball, is having a good, strong closing 5 that you can rely on at the end of games. Pick 26, we have the Indiana Pacers. This pick comes from the Cleveland Cavaliers in the Caris LeVert trade. Very good move by Kevin Pritchard and the Indiana Pacers to pick up a first-round pick for LeVert. And now at this spot, I think that a player that does make some sense, just given the fact that they've had him in the building. Supposedly the workout went very, very well, and I think there's going to be some mutual interest because he's skilled and has size to him. That's G.G. Jackson out of South Carolina. Last couple of mocks, he fell out of the first round for me. I myself am a little bit lower on G.G. Jackson than I think where the consensus is. But I do think for Indiana, if there's going to be a team that is going to be willing to be patient, kind of sit around and wait for a guy to take massive steps forward, I think that the Pacers are a team that makes a lot of sense to do that, because with Tyrese Halliburton on their roster, they kind of fall into the same issue that maybe Utah will, where they're not bad enough to get a top 3 or 4 pick over the next 4 or 5 years, which kind of complicates the rebuild a little bit. So maybe you want to take some swings and stabs on high upside guys like a G.G. Jackson out of South Carolina, who at 6'9", he can handle, he can shoot, and he can get to the rim. Now, he likes to shoot more than he likes to get to the rim, which I think is a big problem with his play style. I think that there are real areas of concern. He doesn't play make very well. He doesn't really read the floor. I would just not put the ball in his hands myself. But with Halliburton, we already know where the ball is going to be, which is why I think Indiana is one of those intriguing fits, and something that if they kind of reshape and retool his game around that, maybe we see him make a massive jump in terms of efficiency. I do think it's worth noting that G.G. Jackson is the youngest player in this year's draft, so it's hard to knock him and say, oh, well, he's kind of a finished product, because he definitely isn't. He has a lot of room to grow. He mentioned that himself in his pre-draft workout with the Indiana Pacers, and we'll see if that translates to him being selected here in the first round by them on draft night. Pick 27, we have the Charlotte Hornets now on the board. Remember, second overall, we had them go with Brandon Miller in this mock draft. We'll see if that actually happens on draft night. But here with this pick, I think one thing that Charlotte is definitely missing is perimeter point of attack defense. And we're going to go with one of the more intriguing ones in this class in Ryan Rupert. You know, in a lot of these mocks, I focus on some of the offensive deficiencies for Rupert, which is part of the reason why he falls out of the top 25 for me here in this mock and goes all the way down to 27 for Charlotte. I think offensively there are some legitimate concerns, but playing next to LaMelo and Brandon Miller, I think, will open that up a little bit. I think he can be a good cutter for them, which I think he has some pretty good instincts to do. And then defensively, that's really the whole point of taking him if you're Charlotte, is you need somebody who's going to guard the basketball, be the main one-on-one defender for you against the best players in the league. And Ryan Rupert maybe is not ready for that day one of his career, but I think he's going to be a player who at some point grows into that role of he's going to be tasked with guarding the other team's best player very consistently. And I think if you ask him to do that, you can rely on some pretty good results from time to time. And he's got active hands. He's going to poke the ball loose. He's going to generate some transition looks for your team, which is a huge positive as well. And I think Charlotte, a team that badly needs point of attack defense, of course, not having Miles Bridges this past year didn't help either. More athleticism, more shot making, more cutting, more just activity, I think is a really good thing for this team. And I think Ryan Rupert could go a long way in helping them. Pick 28, we have the Utah Jazz on the clock again. So far, they've gone with Ausar Thompson, Cason Wallace, and at 28, they're going to follow it up with another swing on upside and a guy that I could really see Danny Ainge falling in love with in Sidy Cissoko from the G League Ignite program. You think about some of the players that we've seen Danny Ainge select in the past, like Guerschon Yabusele. I think he comes to mind, Romeo Langford. Some of these like intriguing athletes who have long strides and they kind of have all the physical tools, but the basketball skills maybe not there quite yet, but they've shown flashes. That's exactly what Sidy Cissoko is. He has a really good spin move, which really is the one move he likes to go to, and he has some intriguing passing vision where he sees something, puts the ball in there kind of on a laser, and sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not, but at least he's trying to see it. And I think that's what Utah's selling themselves on here if they select him in the first round is, look, this guy, he's not polished. He's not ready yet. He's not going to be a high-impact guy day one of his NBA career, but that's the whole point of taking an upside guy is at 28, can we find a kind of gem or diamond in the rough? And I think Sidy Cissoko, he has the physical tools. He's flashed some of the skills that require becoming that type of guy. And I think realistically, 28th overall, it's hard to do better. Now, there's players I prefer, but over Sidy Cissoko at this spot. But at the end of the day, you can at least rationalize and justify the selection this low on the board, in my opinion. Pick number 29, we're back to the Indiana Pacers, who at 26, they went with G.G. Jackson. 7th overall, they went with Jarace Walker. So how do they kind of complement those selections? And for me, this is one that Pacers fans probably haven't heard mocked to them a ton, but I actually think it's a fantastic fit. And it's Brandon Podziemski from Santa Clara, a player who I really like. Brandon Podziemski, I think he's going to have a wide variety of suitors. Now, it's going to be interesting to see where he actually goes on draft night, because I think his range is going to be pretty wide, because I think there's a good number of teams interested in him. Perhaps he falls to being the second best player available on their boards at certain moments and ends up not getting drafted for a little while, which is kind of what happens here in this mock. I've really considered him anywhere after pick 21 or so. So I think Indiana getting him here at 29 does make a lot of sense. He's an extremely active defender, likes to get his hand on the basketball. He played a lot of zone at Santa Clara, which for better or worse, you could argue had some nice positives to it, like his understanding of making plays and getting in the passing lanes and disrupting some stuff. But at the same time, what does he look like as a point of attack defender? I think that's going to be one of the main concerns about him day one of his career. The nice thing is with Jarace Walker and some of these other pieces we've added to Indiana with Miles Turner on the back line, they're not worried as much about one point of attack defender as much as they are the offensive upside. That's exactly what Podziemski brings, as a fantastic shooter, really efficient three-point shot, but also can handle, play make for others a little bit. And I think this kind of solves Indiana's question about who's the secondary or tertiary ball handler on this team. Podziemski probably naturally flows into that role. Not as like a high volume guy, but hey, he could set you up into some stuff, run some dribble handoffs, do things like that. And that's really beneficial for Indiana, who doesn't really need much from that spot. Moving into pick number 30, now we have the Los Angeles Clippers here. And with this selection, I have the Los Angeles Clippers going with Ben Shepherd out of Belmont. Ben Shepherd's been a huge riser toward the back end of this process. Typically once a year, we see some guy take some huge leap that no one was really expecting. Some people ahead of the curve a little bit. I myself was not on Ben Shepherd, to be honest, but now all the buzz I'm hearing is potential or possible first-round pick, which is why I'm mocking him here to the Clippers. And I think if there's a team exploring guards who are ready to contribute, the Clippers are going to be one of those teams at least interested in that. Russell Westbrook is headed toward free agency. The Clippers do not own his bird rights, so the best they can offer him is the taxpayer mid-level exception. We'll see if that's enough to keep him or not. But ultimately, with where the Clippers are at, what they're able to do, there's probably some pressure on them to at least draft a guard of some kind and then kind of reopen up their trade flexibility that way by maybe making Norm Powell expendable in a trade. They have some options, but it's going to be kind of difficult for them to just go willy-nilly here and make a move. They just have to be kind of calculated in it. Ben Shepherd, a really nice selection in my eyes, just because of his ability to handle the pick and roll, knock down perimeter shots. And like I said, he's a big riser who people have targeted as a likely first-round pick at this point. Thank you all so much for watching. I really did have a lot of fun recording this 2023 NBA mock draft. It is currently 6 in the morning at the time I'm finishing this up. So if you could leave a like, it would be greatly appreciated. I've worked really hard on this video, kind of getting my new setup. I worked an entire day at my actual job as well today, which is partially why I'm recording so late. I haven't slept yet, so it's going to be awesome after I edit this video and post it to actually get some sleep. So I hope you guys did enjoy. Again, if you did, leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.